tallow, wax, and the everyday struggle for light. When the sun set in the medieval world, darkness was nearly absolute. Streets turned treacherous, homes became dim caves, and only the faintest glow of hearth fires or small lamps cut the gloom. To hold back the night, people turned to candles, and behind each flickering flame stood the labor of a candle maker, a craft as humble as it was essential. The candle maker's work was not glamorous. It was smelly, repetitive, and physically demanding. Yet his craft gave shape to medieval life, from peasants squinting by weak tallow candles to monks reading by beeswax light. In this section, we will enter his workshop, watch his hands at work, and follow the daily grind of a trade that illuminated the Middle Ages. Light in the medieval world. To understand the candle maker's life, we must first remember how precious light was. Without electricity, medieval nights were deep and enveloping. Candles were expensive enough that many peasants used them sparingly, relying instead on rushlights, strips of rush plants dipped in fat, or on open hearths. Still, candles were indispensable. They lit churches during Mass, guided travelers through dark streets, and allowed work to continue after sunset. In monasteries, beeswax candles burned steadily before altars. In noble households, great candlesticks illuminated feasts. Even in the poorest cottages, a single candle could make the difference between pitch darkness and a fragile glow. The candle maker's task was to produce these humble yet vital objects in endless repetition. Materials: tallow and wax. The two primary materials for candles were tallow and beeswax. Tallow was rendered animal fat, usually from sheep or cattle. It was cheap and widely available, but it smelled foul when burned, producing smoke and soot. Tallow candles were the light of peasants and townsfolk. Beeswax, in contrast, was clean-burning, fragrant, and beautiful. But it was costly, harvested from beehives in limited supply. Beeswax candles were reserved for churches, monasteries, and the wealthy. The candle maker worked with both, though most of his time was spent with tallow. The smell of boiled fat clung to his workshop, his clothes, and his skin. It was a stench associated with his trade, and one reason why candle makers, like tanners, often worked on the outskirts of towns. The workshop. Picture the candle maker's workshop, a dim, smoky space with vats of melted fat, wooden molds, racks of cooling candles, and bundles of rushes or wicks. The floor was sticky with drippings, the air heavy with the odor of tallow. Tools were simple: knives, ladles, molds, and rods for dipping wicks. Candles were made in two main ways. Dipping. Wicks were repeatedly dipped into melted tallow, layer upon layer, until the candle reached the desired thickness. This was slow, requiring patience and rhythm. A rack of wicks was dipped in unison, lifted out, cooled, then dipped again. Dozens of repetitions produced a single candle. Molding. Wooden or metal molds allowed fat or wax to be poured around wicks. This method was faster but required molds to be greased and carefully cleaned. The candle maker moved constantly between vats, molds, and racks, his hands slick with fat, his clothes marked with stains. The daily routine. At dawn, he lit the workshop hearth to melt tallow or wax. The rendering process itself was unpleasant, heating animal fat until it liquefied, skimming off impurities, and straining it into vats. The smell filled the neighborhood. Once the material was ready, the long rhythm of dipping or molding began. Hours passed in repetition. Dip, lift, cool, dip again. Candles were hung on wooden rods to harden. Finished products were trimmed, bundled, and tied with twine. Customers came throughout the day, villagers needing a few tallow candles, a priest commissioning beeswax tapers, or a merchant buying bundles for resale. Payments were often small coins, sometimes barter. The candle maker rarely grew rich, though steady demand meant steady work. Status and reputation. Like many tradesmen, the candle maker held a modest but vital role. He was not honored like a knight or a scholar, but neither was he despised like the miller or toll collector. His reputation was tied to necessity. Everyone needed light. Yet his workshop's smell and his constant dealings with animal fat marked him as somewhat unclean. In some towns, chandlers, candle makers, belonged to guilds, regulating quality, prices, and training. In others, they were independent artisans, scraping by on narrow margins. The distinction between tallow candles for commoners and beeswax for the wealthy reinforced the inequalities of medieval life. The candle maker himself bridged this divide, producing for both rich and poor, but never belonging fully to either world. The candle's symbolism. Beyond practicality, candles carried symbolic weight. They represented light against darkness, knowledge against ignorance, the divine against the profane. In churches, candles burned as offerings. In homes, they marked rituals, births, marriages, and deaths. The candle maker's work, though monotonous, was therefore woven into the fabric of medieval spirituality and culture. Each stub of wax or tallow was more than just fuel. It was a symbol of hope, prayer, or memory. The candle maker's world was one of heat, smell, and endless repetition. His daily grind produced the small flames that kept darkness at bay. He worked with unglamorous materials, lived with the odor of tallow, and endured long hours of dipping and molding. Yet his craft gave light to peasants and princes, monks and merchants alike. But his trade was not only about the physical work of making candles. It was also tied to the economy of guilds, the privileges of towns, and the hierarchy of materials. Who controlled candle making? Who could afford beeswax? And how did this humble trade fit into the larger structure of medieval life? Guilds, economics, and the social divide of light. In the first section, we entered the candle maker's workshop, the vats of melted tallow, the slow dipping of wicks, and the overpowering smell of fat that clung to walls and clothing. Now we widen our view. Candle making was never just a solitary craft. It was woven into the economic, social, and even spiritual fabric of medieval Europe. Behind every candle lay questions of regulation, privilege, and class. The rise of guilds. By the later Middle Ages, Many towns organized their trades into guilds. Candle makers, known in some places as chandlers, often belonged to these associations. Guilds controlled who could make and sell candles, set standards for quality, and regulated prices. Membership was not automatic. An apprentice trained under a master candle maker, learning the craft of dipping, molding, and rendering tallow. After years of service, he might advance to journeyman, and eventually, if he could afford the fees and produce a masterpiece, he might be admitted as a master chandler. Guilds protected members from competition, but they also created divisions. Unauthorized candle making could be punished, sometimes harshly. Housewives making tallow dips at home for sale risked fines or confiscation. The guild insisted that light, like bread or ale, was too important to be left unregulated. Tallow versus beeswax. The guilds also enforced a strict distinction between tallow and beeswax candles. Tallow candles were the work of everyday chandlers. They were cheap, smoky, and smelly, but indispensable. Beeswax candles were often reserved for special guilds, sometimes linked to churches or monasteries. They burned cleanly, symbolized purity, and were used in sacred spaces. The division was not merely about material, it was about status. Tallow chandlers were practical artisans. Beeswax chandlers supplied altars and cathedrals. This separation reinforced the social divide between the light of peasants and the light of the divine. For the tallow candle maker, this meant constant awareness of his lower position. His workshop smelled of fat. His customers were townsfolk and peasants. The beeswax chandler worked with fragrant honeycomb, supplying priests and nobles. Light itself became a symbol of hierarchy. Economics of candle making. Candle making was not a path to riches. The profit margins were narrow, and the work was endless. Tallow had to be purchased from butchers or slaughterhouses, often at fluctuating prices. Beeswax was scarce and costly. Candles were sold in bundles, often tied with twine, and priced by length or weight. Customers bargained constantly. Some paid in coin, others in barter. A peasant might exchange eggs, grain, or ale for a few tallow dips. Larger contracts, like a church's need for dozens of beeswax tapers, went to guild chandlers with connections. Competition existed not only among candle makers, but also with other forms of light. Rushlights, cheap rush stocks dipped in fat, offered brief illumination at little cost. Oil lamps, burning fish or vegetable oil, were used where available. Candle makers had to convince customers of the superiority of their product or simply endure being undercut by cheaper substitutes. Candle makers and the town. In towns, candle makers occupied a peculiar social space. Their workshops were often placed on the edges of markets or near butchers, where tallow was plentiful. The smell made them unwelcome in finer quarters. Yet their craft was indispensable, and their guilds gave them a voice in civic life. In some towns, chandlers contributed to public works, providing candles for town councils or street lighting for festivals. They might march in processions with banners, their craft displayed proudly. At other times, they were scorned for their odors and lowly trade. The town council kept a close eye on candle making, inspecting weights, prices, and measures. Fraud, such as mixing poor quality fat or making candles too short, was punished. Light was a necessity, and cheating in its supply was not tolerated. Candles in religion and ritual. The economic and social world of candle making was deeply bound to religion. Candles were required in vast quantities by churches and monasteries. Monastic schedules of prayer demanded light through the night. Altars required beeswax tapers. Guild processions carried candles as offerings. This constant demand gave candle making a steady connection to the sacred. Even humble tallow makers were indirectly tied to religious life, though their product was often deemed too impure for altars. The very distinction between smoky tallow and pure beeswax mirrored the medieval vision of earthly imperfection versus heavenly purity. Candle makers and social divide. The candle became a symbol of inequality. Wealthy households might burn beeswax candles, filling halls with steady light and pleasant scent. Poor families struggled to afford even a single tallow dip, rationing its use. Some households used candles only for special occasions: Christmas, weddings, funerals. Thus, light itself was stratified. To live in brightness was to live in privilege. To endure smoke and stench was to live as most people did. Candle makers produced for both worlds, but straddled the line uneasily, supplying peasants with foul-smelling tallow and priests with radiant beeswax, never fully belonging to either. Guild politics and conflict. Within towns, guilds of tallow chandlers and beeswax chandlers sometimes clashed. Disputes arose over who could sell what, whether beeswax makers could also sell tallow, and how profits were divided. Court cases and council rulings preserved records of these disputes. For the candle maker, such conflicts added yet another layer of monotony and frustration. Not only did he labor in smell and repetition, but he also had to navigate regulations, fees, and guild politics. His livelihood depended not only on steady hands, but also on careful negotiation of rights and privileges. In this section, we have seen that the candle maker's trade was far from solitary. It was regulated by guilds, divided by material, shaped by economics, and bound to both religion and inequality. Light itself was a commodity, reflecting the social order of medieval life. But what became of this trade over time? Did candle making change with the advent of new technologies? How did the reputation of chandlers endure into later centuries? And what legacy did their work leave in the modern world of light? Decline, transformation, and the legacy of light. We have stood in the candle maker's workshop amid boiling tallow and racks of drying candles. We have seen him in the web of guild rules and the social divide between smoky tallow dips and fragrant beeswax tapers. Now, we turn to the final part of his story, how the candle maker's trade changed, declined, and lingered as both a craft and a symbol long after the medieval world had faded. The steady decline of candle making. By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the humble chandler's world began to shift. Demand for candles remained high, But new technologies and materials slowly eroded the candle maker's traditional place. Improved oils. Olive oil in southern Europe and whale oil in the north provided alternatives for lamps, particularly in wealthier households. Oil burned more steadily than tallow, without the same foul odor. Lanterns. The spread of enclosed lanterns, fueled by oil or fitted with better candles, reduced the need for bulk bundles of cheap tallow dips. Competition. As economies expanded, larger workshops and merchant suppliers began to outpace small artisans. Candle making moved from small family trades to larger scale production. For the village tallow chandler, this meant dwindling relevance. His work endured, but his importance diminished. Beeswax and its endurance. Beeswax candles remained central to churches and monasteries for centuries. Their clean burn and sweet smell symbolized purity and sanctity. Cathedrals consumed enormous quantities of beeswax, ordered in bulk from guild chandlers. Yet even here, the monopoly of traditional chandlers weakened. By the 16th century, monasteries themselves often produced beeswax candles directly from their own hives, bypassing guild artisans. Religious demand remained steady, but control over supply shifted. The old divide, peasants with smoky tallow, priests with glowing beeswax, remained, but the candle maker himself was increasingly sidelined. New materials, spermaceti and beyond. The 18th century introduced a decisive change with spermaceti candles, made from oil extracted from sperm whales. These candles burned brighter, cleaner, and longer than tallow or beeswax. They rapidly became the preferred light in wealthy households. Later, stearic acid candles, derived from purified fats, further improved the quality of artificial light. These were whiter, harder, and far less odorous. Each innovation pushed traditional tallow chandlers further into obsolescence. By the 19th century, with the advent of paraffin wax candles and, most importantly, gaslight and electricity, the world of the medieval chandler was nearly extinguished. Guilds and their end. As candle making shifted, guilds declined. Enlightenment-era reforms across Europe abolished many guild monopolies, seeing them as barriers to free trade. Chandlers lost their protected status, and candle making became just another industry. The guild distinctions between tallow and beeswax vanished. What had once been a deeply stratified world of light collapsed into a market dominated by factories and, eventually, electricity. The candle as symbol. Even as the candle's practical importance declined, its symbolic power endured. Religious. Candles remained vital in Christian rituals, burning on altars, marking baptisms, weddings, and funerals. Their symbolism of divine light never waned. Domestic. Even in the age of electricity, candles retained a place in the home, now for ambience rather than necessity. Cultural. Literature and art continued to use candles as symbols of life's fragility, the passage of time, or the endurance of hope. The medieval candle maker might have faded from memory, but the objects he produced became metaphors for endurance itself. The reputation of chandlers. Unlike millers or toll collectors, candle makers did not bear a reputation for dishonesty or exploitation. Instead, they were remembered as humble, smelly, hard-working artisans. The odor of tallow and the drudgery of dipping defined their image. Folklore sometimes mocked their smell, and records occasionally note disputes over quality or fraud. Yet overall, their reputation was one of necessary service rather than greed. They were pitted more than despised, respected more than feared. Why does the candle maker matter in the sweep of history? His trade was not heroic, nor did it leave behind castles or chronicles, but it illuminated lives. Every book read by candlelight, every monk's prayer in a dim chapel, every peasant's meal eaten after sunset, these depended on his labor. The candle maker embodied the medieval theme of boredom as survival. His endless dipping of wicks, his boiling vats of fat, his racks of cooling candles, all were monotonous. Yet from that monotony came light, both literal and symbolic. His slow work kept the darkness at bay. Final reflection: why it sucked to be a candle maker. To be a medieval candle maker was to live in smell and repetition. It sucked because the work was hot, smelly, and unending. The pay was modest, the hours long, and the prestige low. He stood on the margins of towns, tolerated but not celebrated. And yet, his dull labor mattered. He was the quiet illuminator of medieval life, the one who turned fat and wax into survival. His hands shaped the flames that lit altars and cottages, courts and kitchens. His work was forgotten even as his products shaped memory itself.